Today we have a special treat. We have Professor Robert Reich. Professor Reich is an emeritus professor in our School of Public Policy. He's the senior fellow of the Center for Developing Economies, the former Secretary of Labor, one of our country's most foremost public intellectuals, and a beloved educator on this campus. He's been speaking and writing for over 40 years on the dangers of political division and economic inequality and the tensions between democratic institutions and what he calls supercapitalism. He received a BA in history from Dartmouth College, a Rhodes Scholarship and MA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford, and a JD from Yale. He served as Secretary of Labor in the Bill Clinton administration and taught at Brandeis University before joining our faculty in 2006. Since coming to Berkeley, he's published 10 books, bringing the total up to, I think, 19 now, as well as publishing in national periodicals like The Atlantic, The New York Times, and in award-winning documentaries like the recent Netflix special Saving Capitalism. Maybe most importantly, he taught a wildly popular course on wealth and poverty in this very room, I believe at this very time slot. And so we're really, really privileged to welcome him back to this space. In today's talk, Professor Reich discusses the historical and political roots of the Trump phenomenon. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Reich.
Thank you, Tavi. Well, thank you very much, Tavi, and thank you all for joining me today. I feel like I've been here before, at exactly this time, in this slot, in this place. I thought the best way of beginning might be to say a couple of things in preparation. One, and it should probably go without saying, but I will say it, an explanation is not a justification. So nothing that I say that tries to put in context and explain what has happened and why we are where we are, should be understood as a justification for what has happened. The second point I want to make is that although I am going to talk about some economic history and policy history, I'm not an economic determinist. There are obviously other factors at play here that are responsible for the condition that I call, and I will call Trumpism. We're coming up to the 100-day mark of Donald Trump's, well, you could say administration. I call it a regime. It feels not like 100 days. To some of you, maybe it feels like 100 weeks or 100 months or years. What I'm going to say, probably the beginning is the easiest. In 2015, just about 10 years ago, I was in the Midwest. I was doing some research for a book I was then preparing. My books, by the way, are the kind of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up. But this particular book I was particularly interested in terms of Americans' attitudes toward politics and economics and how they fit together. And I was in Missouri and in Michigan and in Wisconsin. Then I went down to North Carolina, and most of the states that are now considered swing states, I interviewed people, kind of focus groups I put together. Some of the people I had known from years before when I was Secretary of Labor. I had gone out to those same states, but it was not just those people, it was their families, and I met others that they brought in to these focus groups. I tried to make them as diverse as possible in terms of politics and race and religion and any other characteristic, so that I could get a little bit of a sense of where people were at in their relationship to the economy and politics. Now remember, this was 2015. In fact, to be more precise, it was October of 2015. And I asked a variety of questions, some of which had to do with the current candidates for president. And at that time, you may remember, in the Democratic Party, the leading candidate was Hillary Clinton, and in the Republican Party, the leading candidate was Jeb Bush. Anybody remember that? And I asked these free-floating focus group participants, I said, well, who are you interested in as a possible presidential candidate? I mean, put aside Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. You may be interested in them. If you want to vote for them, I'm very interested as well. But I just want to explore your political views and your political philosophy and see a little bit how it's shaped by your experience. And so, is there anybody that you really are excited about? Is there anyone in the world, in the constellation of American politicians or any possibilities? And I'd listen, and in every one of those focus groups, in every one of those states, most people responded by saying Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. In fact, very often, it was the same person who said Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And when that first began, I think it was in Missouri, I said, excuse me, you may not have understood my question. I want to talk about what you are interested in as a possible presidential candidate. And they would say, Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And I'd follow that up with several questions. Well, why Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump? First of all, they are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And secondly, they're not even officially parts of the political party. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat, Donald Trump is not a Republican. So how do you, well, they said they like them because they're not politicians. And they like them because both of them are authentic. I heard the word authentic repeated to me. And then I probed further, and I heard again and again the word, well, they'll shake things up. Shake things up. My mind has gone back to that shake things up over the last 100 days. And then I would probe further. And I'd say, what do you mean shake things up? What needs to be shaken up? And they would tell me, and that offered the window into a discussion of what they were really concerned about, their jobs, their wages, their economic security. Most of the people who I had interviewed years before, in the early 70s, when I was Secretary of Labor, their parents, for the most part, had told me in the early 90s that they were upset and they were worried about the future, but what was different about them in the year 2015, or their children, or their relatives, was that this time they were not just worried or anxious, they were actually angry. Anger was a common denominator of those meetings I had in 2015. Much more anger than I ever came across in the same states, in the same communities, among many of the same people, or at least their parents, the same families, in the early 90s. So, what happened? And is there any relationship between that anger, that economic insecurity, the worry about their jobs, the worry about the economy overall, their wages? Is there any relationship between that and where we are today? And I think there is a great deal of relationship. I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour. I want to show you just one chart. Just one. Those of you who, anybody here took my course? You took my course. You remember the charts? I had a lot of them, didn't I? No, today is just one. But it's very important because it reveals a great deal. And maybe now we can turn to that chart. Now, for what I used to call chartophobes, remember, I can understand anybody who gets a little bit nervous looking at charts like this, but the horizontal axis that starts around 1940 and goes all the way to today shows different years, and the vertical axis has to do with productivity. And you can see that that dark line that goes pretty steadily upward is the American economy getting more and more productive. But what I also want you to take a look at is that blue line. That blue line is hourly compensation growth. The growth of hourly compensation. Now, hourly compensation, people who are paid on an hourly basis are mostly your workers, your working class people, people who, on the whole, don't have a college degree. They, on the whole, are not salaried workers. They are workers who are working on an hourly basis. They are salaried, but they're working on an hourly basis. And what you can see, and they are the majority of the working people in this country. And what you can see is that between 1948 and just before 1980, the growth of productivity and the growth of the typical worker's wage moved in tandem. In fact, the relationship between productivity growth and wage growth was so tight that a lot of economists and a lot of people who spent a lot of time looking at these kinds of variables assumed that that was inevitable, that as productivity improved, the typical worker's wage would go up. Because, after all, the typical worker was generating more and more wealth. But you see, something happened. And not only does that blue line show that the typical worker's hourly wage stopped growing, but the gap between productivity gains and the typical worker's wage kept on growing itself. That gap is significant. It's important. It has political potency. Why did that happen? And where did all the money go? If it didn't go to the typical worker's wages, where did it go? Class. It went upward. There was a dramatic redistribution of income and subsequently wealth, because wealth is, after all, a product of somebody's income over time, upward. Now, I saw this happen. I am not exactly an innocent bystander. And one of the reasons that I am talking about this and writing about this is because I feel a sense of complicity in a way, but more, I saw the reckoning coming. Now, the typical family in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, I grew up. I was born in 1946. This graph pretty much trails and corresponds to my lifetime. So the typical family in the 50s, 60s, even the 1970s assumed something that we all, to the extent that we talked about it at all, called a social compact, a social contract. And that was that you, if you worked hard, and you played by the rules, you would see your income continually rise through your lifetime. And your children's income would be even higher than yours. In fancy terms, it was called the American dream, but it wasn't a dream. It was the actuality in post-war, post-World War II America. As you can see, people continuously traded up. They bought to the extent that they could afford it, and most people could afford a house, and you could do it on one income and a car and maybe an appliance or two, and then you could trade up and get a slightly bigger house if you had more kids. If you needed a bigger car, you traded up. And your children, not only did they have a shot at going to college, and maybe you did not, but they also had a shot at pretty good jobs. The unionized sector of the American private sector in those years was about a third of all workers in the private sector were unionized. And that unionization gave workers bargaining power to get better and better wages. When I became Secretary of Labor in start of 1993, one of the first things that we struggled with was the North America Free Trade Act. Was that a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Ross Perot, who had actually been a candidate, some of you remember, in the 1992 election, had predicted that if you had a North America Free Trade Act and a trading system that would unite Canada and Mexico and the United States, there would be a giant sucking sound. That was Ross Perot's term, of jobs and good jobs, manufacturing jobs, south of the border. Well, as Labor Secretary, I was involved in a lot of discussions about whether NAFTA should go forward, and I had, frankly, some worries. But I had larger worries when it came to a second free trade agreement, had to do it with China. China's joining the World Trade Organization. My fear that I expressed pretty openly, at least inside the administration, was that if China joined the World Trade Organization, you would have Chinese goods flooding the United States. And those manufactured items could not possibly be maintained at the same time you maintained American manufacturing. That a lot of the Midwest and a lot of manufacturing jobs would vanish. Now, people argued with me at the time. They said, no, if they do vanish, it's because of technology. It's not because of trade. And we had a lot of debates. And they were good-natured debates. The people, you hear about the Trump White House, and I've been involved in several White Houses before. White Houses tend to be places where there are a lot of debates and there are strong personalities. They are not like the West Wing. It's not happy places. These are not places where people really enjoy each other's company, but they can be very civil places. And the Clinton administration and the administration I was involved with before that, the Carter administration, and I was a little bit involved in the Obama administration, they were civil, and people had strong views, but people respected each other's strong views. Bill Clinton decided that we would go forward with Chinese accession to the World Trade Organization. There was another debate in the Clinton White House having to do with deregulation of financial markets. I thought it was dangerous. You see, during the 1930s, after the great crash of 1929, Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration had put into place a lot of controls, regulations on big finance, on the banks, to make sure that we could not have another 1929, another great crash. And yet the financial community was becoming politically so powerful, as were global companies. That's why there was such pressure for international trade regimes and free trade. But at the same time, the financial community was becoming so politically powerful that they got deregulation. They got deregulation from starting with Ronald Reagan, and then from George H.W. Bush, and then it came to Bill Clinton, and there was more deregulation. And frankly, I worried about that. Now, I was Secretary of Labor. I wasn't Secretary of the Treasury. I was not directly responsible for any kind of regulation of Wall Street, but I did worry. There was a woman named Brooksley Born, who was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Now, that's the kind of term, when I say Commodity Futures Trading Commission, your eyes probably glaze over, right? Can you hear what I'm saying now? Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Brooksley Born. She was the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. She came to the White House, she came to the Secretary of the Treasury, she came to a lot of us, and she said, we have got to regulate derivatives. Derivatives. What are derivatives? I remember asking her. Well, derivatives are paper. They're paper, they're promises. They are derived from the value of shares of stocks and bonds, but they are derived from them. They are based on them, but they are fancy, and we need to regulate them because they're getting out of control. The derivatives market is huge. It is growing. Nobody is regulating them. I'm worried about them, she said. So number one, trade. Number two, Wall Street. Number three, I was becoming worried as Secretary of Labor. I was becoming worried about unions. Unions were getting smaller and smaller. A smaller and smaller proportion of the workforce was unionized. Why? Because starting with Ronald Reagan, it was thought to be legitimate to try to bust unions if you were a CEO of a corporation. Before that time, it was not thought to be legitimate, but Ronald Reagan had fired the air traffic controllers who went on strike. They had no right to go on strike. They were public employees. He fired them, but that firing of the air traffic controllers seemed to legitimize CEOs going after their own unions. And the National Labor Relations Board, which is supposed to try to control and maintain the rights of workers to unionize, was overwhelmed with allegations of unfair trade practices, unfair union practices. So again, one, trade. Number two, Wall Street. Number three, unions. What does it all mean when you put it together? Well, what it means when you put it together is less and less bargaining power on behalf of average workers, and more bargaining power on behalf of finance. If there's a simple way of encapsulating what happened over the last 40 years, I would say that is it. American families used three methods to maintain a semblance of standard of living. Number one, everybody worked harder, longer hours. Number two, women went into the paid workforce. Now, poor women had been working all along, but working class and middle class women had not been working. By 1979, by 1980, by 1981, in that period of time, there was a huge increase in women working for pay. I wish I could attribute it all to women's opportunities, wonderful women's opportunities opening up. No, women went into the workforce in order to maintain family incomes that were under threat because male workers, their wages were declining or their jobs were disappearing. Number three, when those two coping mechanisms, working longer hours and women going into the paid workforce, did not suffice to keep family incomes on the upward trajectory that they had been used to, the third coping mechanism was to use their homes as piggy banks. That is, get home loans. The value of homes kept on increasing, and that generation of Americans did have homes that they lived in and owned, and so they used their homes as collateral to get loans or refinance their homes. And that was the third coping mechanism. But then came 2008 and the financial crisis, which to me was a direct and almost inevitable outgrowth of the deregulation of Wall Street. In other words, what you see happening during this period of time, starting in the late 70s, but continuing through the 80s and 90s, and certainly we contributed to it in the Clinton administration, but all these trends had started before us. What you saw is American workers who were based on an hourly wage, working class, they lost their unions, or unions became far weaker. They were in direct competition or indirect competition with much cheaper goods coming into the United States, mostly from China. And thirdly, we had Wall Street exploding. The financial crisis meant that the third coping mechanism was no longer adequate. People could no longer use their homes as piggy banks. They could no longer get the kinds of loans on the basis of using their homes as collateral that they could get before. And I think that the explosion of Wall Street, followed by the bailout of the Wall Street banks, was a kind of political and economic trauma for this country. Now, I wasn't then in the administration, but I was around the administration. I certainly did meet with Obama administration officials. And you remember the bailout of Wall Street started under the George W. Bush administration, but then continued with Obama. Obama faced, one of the first things he faced was, what do you do about this implosion of Wall Street? And I remember talking with Obama officials about the fact that they were rescuing the banks. Why do we have to rescue the banks? Why not simply subject the banks to bankruptcy? We have a bankruptcy code. We put the banks through bankruptcy. They rearrange and reorganize their assets. No, I was told over and over again, that's too dangerous. If the banks cannot make it, if they start melting down, the whole economy, the whole global economy is endangered. Well, why can't we bail out, if we're going to bail out the banks, why can't we bail out homeowners whose homes, who cannot any longer afford to pay their home loans, whose homes are being foreclosed upon? Doesn't that seem unfair? And the word I got back, well, there's no easy way of doing it. I said, well, there may be some way of doing it. It doesn't have to be easy. Well, there's no real way, practical way of bailing out the homeowners. But I said, we're bailing out the bankers for their carelessness. And no banker is going to jail. How do you think this looks? And it's also unfair. soon after the bailouts of the banks, and millions of Americans losing their homes and their savings and their jobs, we had two parallel movements in the United States. Political movements, social movements. One was called the Tea Party movement on the right. On the left was called the Occupy movement. Some of you may remember them. In fact, in 2013, we had a big rally, an Occupy rally on Sproul Plaza. Now, those two movements occurring simultaneously were interesting because they were both responding to what was perceived to be a rigging of the American market in favor of the big banks and big institutions. Occupy said, no, the problem is the rigging is by the big banks and by the big corporations and the CEOs. The Tea Party movement said, no, the rigging is really by the government. But when you got close to both critiques, they were both about the same thing. They were about government and business being too close. They were about corruption, fundamentally. To both the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement, government corruption, corporate welfare was the core problem. The lineal descendants of the Occupy movement were people on the left like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders came out of Occupy. His themes came out of the Occupy movement. On the other side, the Tea Party movement, the lineal descendants, in terms of themes, in terms of anger, behind those themes, Donald Trump. The Democratic Party didn't want Bernie Sanders, and it was very clear. They did everything they could to make sure he was not going to be the candidate in 2016. The Republican Party tried to dislodge Donald Trump. They were unsuccessful. Donald Trump, as we all know, did what he did. What we face today is something that I began to see very early on. And what is distressing to me is that I saw it and I warned about it, and it's not so much that I told you so, but it's that I could not personally summon other people to join me in stopping what was happening. And right after I show you a 1-minute film clip of what I am talking about, I want to ask you for your questions, okay? All right, let's have the film clip.
My friends, we are on the way to becoming a two-tiered society, composed of a few winners and a larger group of Americans left behind, whose anger and whose disillusionment is easily manipulated. Once unbottled, mass resentment can poison the very fabric of society, the moral integrity of a society, replacing ambition with envy, replacing tolerance with hate. Today, the targets of that rage are immigrants and welfare mothers and government officials and gays and an ill-defined counterculture. But as the middle class continues to erode, who will be the targets tomorrow?
Well, you can see my frustration, since I've been saying the same thing for 35 years. But what I want to make sure you understand is that I shared that with you not in the spirit of I told you so. I shared that with you in the spirit of there are fundamental forces at work here. Donald Trump is the consequence, is the culmination of decades in which some other steps could have been made, some other decisions could have been made, but were not made. Again, I'm not an economic determinist. This was not all determined, but as I said in 1994, and that was from 1994, that was right after the Democrats got walloped in the midterm elections of 1994. As I said then, we're becoming a two-tiered society. Now we are much more dramatically a two-tiered society. And that does breed, as I saw in 2015, a degree of resentment and a degree of anger, a sense among a lot of people that the game is rigged. And when you have that many people beginning to believe that the game is rigged against them, they are very vulnerable to a demagogue who says to them, the problem is, your problem is them, immigrants, or LGBTQ plus people, or transgender people, or people who are not US citizens who are here in the United States on visas, or a deep state comprised of federal workers, or law firms, or prestigious universities. You see where all this leads, and you see where all this comes from. Now, my hope, and it's a very sincere hope, is that the silver lining on all of this is that we all, having experienced what we are experiencing, understand the need and necessity for fundamental reform in the sense of an economic system that is not rigged, that is not dominated by big money, that actually gives opportunity, equal opportunity for anybody to get ahead, regardless of where they are in the pecking order, and that is a society that respects and promotes diversity rather than rejecting it. Thank you. Now we have a few minutes. We have a few minutes for your questions. We have some microphones ready, so please put up your hands if you've got questions.
Hello, longtime fan. So
Is that your name, longtime fan?
that's my name. My name's Rebecca. Now in my house and amongst my friends, professors and not professors, we've started to talk about flight. And I don't like to think about, there's the captain on the sinking ship and what you think about that, but I just want to know what your thoughts are about that. I mean, my mother fled Vienna in 1939, and we were talking today about what were the conversations going on in those households, and I have other friends who are like, oh, it'll be okay, whatever that means. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, running away to some, it's hard to know where exactly.
You mean, am I hopeful?
What do you think about that as an option? Like, I think of you as someone who's like, no, let's stay here and fight, but it also must be a palpable thought, concern.
Yeah, and I apologize. I need to know what it is, my thoughts about what's
About leaving the country.
leaving the country.
Yeah.
Well, if somebody, it's not easy for most people to leave the country. This is not really an option. 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And most Americans have not even ever been into a foreign country or even taken a plane anywhere. So you're talking about an option that is not a serious option for most people. I think the most realistic option in terms of looking at, say, the 1930s as a parallel is not letting us get near that degree of authoritarianism. Now, we're pretty close. Yes, we are. And that's my hope, is that we all join together, not left and right as we traditionally know left and right, because it's not a matter of left and right anymore. It's really a matter of democracy versus neo-fascism or authoritarianism. And I read, for example, a columnist, a New York Times columnist who I know pretty well, who I disagree with on almost everything, David Brooks. And he wrote a few days ago a column about the necessity for a national civic uprising. I don't know what he meant, but when he and others like him start saying that, then it seems to me there's a possibility that we can get a coalition going that is much bigger than just the Democrats.
Hello, my name's Ariana. My question was, did the followers of the Tea Party turn to somebody like Trump, who comes from a business and corporate background, due to their blaming of the government instead of the banks and corporations for their unfair bailouts following 2008?
I'm going to ask you to say that again.
Okay. Did the followers of the Tea Party turn to somebody like Trump, who comes from a business and a corporate background, due to their blaming of the government instead of the banks and corporations for the unfair bailouts following 2008?
Well, I think this goes back to the point about the traditional politics in America. You had and have had a left that believes in big government, or has believed in the power of government and the importance of government to constrain greed, constrain business. But you also have a right, a traditional right, that doesn't like government, that says freedom is more important, and if you let business do business and you cut taxes, and you know the rest. I think we're beyond that. I think that we are now in a moment in which that debate is over. It hasn't been resolved in the sense, I don't mean it's over in terms of it's resolved. I mean that we are now struggling with a much larger set of questions about democracy and autocracy. And I think that the business community has got to, and this is a variation on what I just said, the leaders of American business have got to stand up. Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the United States, that got bailed out big time in 2008 and is considered to be the voice of American business. Jamie Dimon needs to come out strictly and strongly and boldly and say, Donald Trump should not be president. And anybody knows Jamie Dimon? Tell him that.
Hello. Oh. Hi, Professor. I'm a graduating senior, so I was really happy that I was able to fit in hearing you lecture before I graduate. But basically my question is, as a young person, I feel everything you're saying, and a lot of my peers at Berkeley do, but at the same time, there's this dichotomy in Berkeley of I feel like so many of us are just taught, and the things you're talking about, society teaches us, okay, let's go into finance, let's go into tech. It seems like the way to succeed as a young person. But with all of these conversations about President Trump and everything, it's very hard for me to just figure out, okay, what can I do as a young person? It feels like I can't do anything. It feels like I need to survive and I need to take care of myself. But at the same time, there's so many issues that feel out of my control. So I guess I'm just asking for advice. Like, what should us as young people, as young Berkeley students, do on the day-to-day to, I don't know, be okay?
Well, let me just say, you are a graduate, or will shortly be a graduate, of one of the best, if not the best, public institutions and public universities in the entire world. You will do fine. You don't have to worry. Your object in life, I cannot presume to tell you, but I hope it's not about making as much money as possible. I hope it's about helping the country and the world be a moral universe, and that social justice and human rights are part of that moral universe. And if that's the case, you will make as much money as you need, you will have a fine family, but part of your time, I don't mean all of your time, but I hope that part of your time, 1 day a week, 4 days a month, is devoted to something larger. And I hope that the ethos of Berkeley, if we contribute anything to the world, it's that we contribute young people who have that moral courage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right,
do
I
we
think
have
we have
time? We have time for
We can take one
a
more
couple
short one.
So I want to ask about how do you think this here?
Oh, there you are. Okay.
So how do you think the society in U.S. right now, the situation that you mentioned in the current situation right now, is different from the society like in the World War II where Roosevelt was the president?
How can society, sorry,
Like how is it different? The society, it's the same U.S. but in different.
I just need to, my hearing is going, and I need you to say it again. How can this society or another society
Be different, because as far as I know, in World War II Roosevelt period of time, the productivities and the tax to the wealth are very high, and
how can society be different?
yeah,
Because in World War II, productivity was very high,
and the wealth was like very high taxed.
and
They have very high tax.
we had high tech
Taxes.
taxes. Oh, I see. So I guess if I'm correct in understanding and interpreting you, you're saying, how can we possibly return to a time when we had high productivity and high marginal taxes? Is that what you're saying? To finance all the things that we need to do for our people. Or maybe I misinterpreted your question. If I misinterpreted your question, you can ask it again.
Yeah, like you mentioned that. The society are now more controlled by like the finance and Wall Street, but not instead of the working force.
Right. So how do we return to a society that is not dominated by Wall Street and finance, but a society that is centered on working people and their betterment?
Yeah.
Well, I hinted at it. I think we do that by rebuilding the institutions that working people need, and then going beyond that. And I don't mean we have to go. It's not that we have to go back only to labor unions. I think a lot of people, for example, need help with caring for their loved ones, child care and elder care. I think we want to move toward profit sharing. A lot of companies are doing extremely well, but their workers are doing very poorly. Well, there ought to be either mandated or incentives for sharing the profits. I don't think that the issue is free trade versus not free trade. I think it's much more interesting and subtle than that. And we need an industrial policy in which we invest in the industries of the future and bring our workforce toward those industries, give them the training they need to be contributors to those future industries. And we may have to protect those industries from foreign competition for a limited amount of time. And I could go on, and I've taught courses, entire courses, about your question.